We don't always know why a room feels settled before anyone speaks. Sometimes it's the way chairs are arranged. Sometimes it's who sits together. That morning, in a small courthouse outside Asheville, the decision seemed to exist before the judge even looked up. Leah Merrick walked in holding a thin folder, shoulders still, face unreadable. She owned a modest yoga studio and an aging delivery van, and the people who raised her were about to explain why none of that should count. This is where she remembers it beginning. The bench felt colder than it looked. I sat down carefully. Like sudden movement might draw attention I couldn't afford. Jonah Reed set his binder in front of him and slid a legal pad my way. He didn't say anything. Just a small nod. Steady. Across the aisle. Caleb sat between our parents. Dad wore his gray suit, pressed sharp, posture straight. Mom had on the scarf she saved for church and courtrooms. Caleb leaned back. Relaxed. One ankle resting on his knee. Like this was a meeting he expected to win. The clerk called the case. We stood, then sat. Judge Helena Ortiz flipped through the file, her expression neutral. Caleb's attorney rose first. His voice was smooth, practiced. He talked about concern, about family stepping in when someone couldn't manage the weight of responsibility. Words like support and protection floated through the room. Then Dad was called. He walked to the stand without looking at me, raised his hand, swore to tell the truth. When he sat, he faced the judge directly, as if delivering a report. Leah works hard, he began. No one disputes that. She's persistent. She grinds. His pause was deliberate, but effort isn't leadership. Jonah's pen stopped moving. Dad continued, calm, confident. The studio happens to be doing well right now, but not because of strong management. Asheville's wellness market has surged. That tide lifts a lot of small operations. He folded his hands. And there's residual goodwill. My father was well known in the community. His name still opens doors. My chest tightened, slow and familiar. This business succeeded despite Leah's limitations. Dad went on. And without a real leader, it won't last. It will collapse. He shifted slightly, eyes flicking toward Caleb. Caleb has vision. He understands growth. He knows how to build something sustainable. Then he said it, like it was obvious. He deserves it more. Mom brought her hands together in a few light claps, almost reflexive, as if the statement marked an ending. Something in me went very still. We noticed how no one in the gallery reacted. No surprise, no discomfort, just quiet acceptance. Like this version of me fit neatly into a story they already believed. Judge Ortiz stopped turning pages. She rested her fingers on the file and looked straight at me. Ms. Merrick, she said, voice even, precise. Do you deny that you are incapable of managing this business? Caleb's attention sharpened. Mom's hands froze mid-clap. Jonah rose smoothly. Your Honor, the defense will respond after the plaintiff rests, if the court permits. Judge Ortiz nodded, but her eyes stayed on me a moment longer. I swallowed. My mouth tasted dry. Dad sat back down, satisfied. Caleb leaned toward our parents, whispering something I couldn't hear. Jonah bent closer to me. Let them finish, he murmured. Let them say it all. I nodded, because that was familiar. I nodded because I had learned a long time ago what happened when I didn't. The hearing moved on. Words stacked up. Market luck, weak management, concern, capability. I sat there and let them talk, not because I didn't have a voice, but because this time, silence wasn't surrender. It was timing. I learned what my role was before anyone ever named it. When voices tightened, I softened mine. When Mom's patience thinned, I filled the gap. When Dad came home carrying the weight of his day, I stayed out of the way and made sure nothing added to it. No one asked me to do those things. They just happened. And once they did, they were expected. Caleb never had to learn that. The afternoon the vase broke, I was 9. I was sitting on the living room floor folding laundry, matching socks, lining them up by color the way Mom liked. Caleb was running through the house with a soccer ball even though he'd been told not to. The crash came first. Then the sharp sound of glass skidding across tile. Mom came in fast, Dad right behind her. Caleb froze, then started crying immediately. Loud. Panicked. He kept saying it slipped, that he hadn't meant to. Mom looked at the broken pieces, then at me. Her voice stayed calm, controlled. "I'm not disappointed in Caleb," she said. "He's still a child." Her eyes didn't leave my face. "I'm disappointed in you. You let me down." I stood there, hands empty, heart racing. I tried to explain that I hadn't been there, that I was folding laundry. Dad cut in before I finished the sentence. "You're older," he said. "You should have known better." Caleb's crying slowed. He wiped his face with his sleeve and peeked at me. When he saw no one was looking at him anymore, the tears stopped. Mom sighed, tired but composed. "You know how sensitive your brother is. You're supposed to help keep things calm. Supposed to." I was sent to my room. No television, no books. Just quiet and the understanding that something invisible had been assigned to me, and I'd failed at it. After that, the pattern stuck. If Caleb forgot his homework, Mom asked why I hadn't reminded him. If Dad came home tense, Mom asked me to keep the house quiet. At dinner, I watched faces instead of eating. I learned when to change the subject, when to agree, when to disappear. They called me understanding, mature, easy. What they meant was useful. By the time I was a teenager, I knew how to anticipate disappointment before it arrived. I stopped offering explanations. I stopped correcting the record. It never made things better. Silence did. It took effort. It meant paying attention all the time, choosing when not to speak, absorbing what other people didn't want to carry. No one thanked me for it, but everyone relied on it. By the time I reached middle school, I understood how explanation sounded in our house. It sounded like defiance. It sounded like delay. It sounded like I was asking someone to take responsibility they didn't want. So I learned to keep things short. At dinner one night, Dad asked how school was going. Caleb answered first, talking about a group project he hadn't finished. He laughed like it was part of the story, like it would all work out because it usually did. Mom smiled. "You'll figure it out." When Dad looked at me, I said, "Fine." He waited. "Anything else?" I shook my head and kept my eyes on my plate. Mom reached over and straightened the napkin on my lap, smoothing it down. "She's tired," she said. "She pushes herself too hard." It sounded like concern. It always did. After dinner, I washed dishes without being asked. The water ran hot. My hands turned red. Caleb disappeared into his room. Dad settled into the couch. Mom stayed in the kitchen, watching me like she might need something. "You don't have to do everything," she said. I kept rinsing. She leaned against the counter. "You know I appreciate you." I dried my hands and waited. Appreciation was never the end of the sentence. "You just need to learn when to step back." She added, "Let other people take responsibility." I nodded. That was the exchange. My agreement for quiet. At school, teachers called me reliable. Friends handed me problems and waited for solutions. I listened more than I spoke. I learned how to be useful without taking up space. At home, I learned how to absorb moods, raised voices, tight silences. The look Mom got when Dad was disappointed. The look Dad got when things weren't orderly. When Caleb forgot his lunch. Mom called me from work and asked why I hadn't reminded him. When Dad missed a deadline and came home tense, Mom asked me to keep things calm. "You're good at this," she told me once, handing me a stack of towels. "You don't make things harder." So I stopped correcting them when they were wrong. I stopped volunteering details. I stopped expecting anyone to notice. Silence wasn't passive. It was work, constant adjustment, choosing the moment not to speak, again and again. until it felt normal. By the time I left for college, I didn't think of it as silence anymore. It was training. Grandpa Franklin died on a Tuesday morning. Mom left a voicemail instead of calling. "Your grandfather passed peacefully," she said. "We'll let you know about the arrangements." Peaceful was the word she always used when something was already finished. The service was small. People from the neighborhood, a few faces from the community center. Caleb arrived late, slid into a seat near the aisle, nodded at people he recognized. Dad stood stiff and formal, like grief was something you managed with posture. Mom kept her hands folded in her lap, eyes dry. Afterward, we went to the attorney's office. The room smelled like old paper and burnt coffee. The attorney opened a folder and looked at me first. "Your grandfather was very explicit," he said. "This will was properly witnessed and notarized. There's no ambiguity." He read it out loud. The yoga studio, the delivery van, the deed. Everything transferred to me. Dad leaned back before the reading was finished. "That old place," Mom tilted her head. "It barely breaks even." Caleb frowned. "I thought he sold that years ago." The attorney slid the keys across the desk toward me. They were heavier than I expected. At dinner that night, Dad pushed his food around with his fork. "You should sell it quickly," he said. "Don't sink money into something that's already tired." Mom nodded. "It's sentimental, not practical." Caleb changed the subject and started talking about a possible promotion. No one asked me what I thought. That weekend, I drove out to see the studio alone. The sign was still crooked. The windows were streaked with dust. Inside, the mirrors were cloudy and the floor creaked under my feet. The air smelled like old wood and cleaning spray that hadn't worked in a long time. I locked the door behind me and stood there for a minute with the keys in my hand. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone I'd gone. I didn't ask for advice. I didn't ask for help. Mom called a few days later. "Have you thought about selling?" "Not yet." She paused. "Just don't let nostalgia cloud your judgment." Dad's voice came through in the background. "Be practical." I said I would think about it. That night, I spread the paperwork across my kitchen table. The deed, the transfer documents, everything in my name, clean, legal, solid. The next morning, I took a day off work. I stopped by the hardware store, bought cleaning supplies, and went back to the studio. I started with the mirrors, one panel at a time. Vinegar, paper towels. My arms ached before the glass cleared. No one knew where I was. No one asked. And for the first time, that silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like space. The heater quit in January. I found out during a 6 a.m. class when my breath fogged in the air and one woman laughed softly, rubbing her hands together. 3 people had shown up anyway. I offered to cancel. No one moved. "Let's just keep going." Someone said, "We're already here." We stayed. Afterward, I stood in the back room with my coat still on and called a repair service. The technician arrived that afternoon, older, careful, the kind who didn't rush bad news. "This unit's been coasting," he said, tapping the side. "Fixing it right won't be cheap." He named the cost. I nodded. "You sure I'm sure?" I paid. I kept the receipt. February brought rain that wouldn't let up. I canceled outdoor sessions 3 weekends in a row. People texted to check in. One message stuck with me. "Whenever you're ready, we'll be back." By March, I had 6 regulars. By summer, 12. I capped classes at 18 because the room felt right that way. I bought new mats one at a time. Blocks, straps, a small sound system. Everything went into a spreadsheet with dates and notes in the margins. The idea for the van came one night when I was loading equipment for a sunrise class. I stood there staring at the empty cargo space and realized it didn't have to just haul things. It could be the class. I spent evenings measuring, sketching, moving things around. I stripped the inside down, added storage, padded the walls, mounted hooks for headphones, quiet music, no announcements, just movement and breath. The first mobile session was in a city park at dawn. 8 people showed up wearing headphones, moving together in silence while the sun came up. A couple walkers stopped to watch. No complaints, no noise issues, just calm. Someone clapped when it ended, then caught herself and smiled. Word spread. A man from the neighboring office knocked on the studio door one afternoon. Arms crossed. "We've had complaints before," he said. But lately, nothing. I adjusted the schedule. I told him. He nodded once. "It's working." At night, I worked my day job, then drove to the studio. I wiped mirrors, folded blankets, answered emails. When my hands started to ache, I wrapped them and kept going. Mom called during that stretch. I let it ring. Her voicemail talked about concern and balance. I listened while scrubbing the floor and didn't call back. Caleb texted, "How's the little project? It's growing." I wrote, "Good for you." By the end of the first year, the numbers steadied. Not flashy, just solid. Enough to cover costs and breathe. The spreadsheet showed more black than red. One morning after class, a woman lingered by the door. "This place feels intentional," she said, like someone thought it through. I nodded. My throat felt tight. That night, I locked up and stood alone in the room. The heater hummed. The mirrors were clear. The van sat outside. Ready? I turned off the lights and closed the door. Keys warm in my hand. Mom's message came through while I was stacking mats after the last evening class. "Your father's worried about you," she wrote. "You've been pushing yourself too hard. Maybe it's time to let Caleb carry some of this." I sat down on the floor and read it again, then once more. Another message followed almost immediately. "You don't have to prove anything anymore." I didn't reply. 2 days later, Dad asked to meet. Not at the house, not at the studio. A coffee shop near his office, neutral and quiet. He was already seated when I arrived, jacket folded beside him, cup untouched. "You look exhausted," he said, eyes scanning my face like he was taking inventory. I set my bag down and waited. "This isn't criticism," he continued. "It's concern. You've always taken on pressure that wasn't meant for you." I watched a drop of condensation slide down his glass. "The studio's become something," he said. "That brings responsibility. Risk." "I know," I said. He shook his head gently. "No, you endure. That's not the same as leading." There it was again. "I'm doing this to free you," he said, lowering his voice. "You should be thanking me. Caleb has the temperament for growth. The vision. You've done enough." My fingers curled around to the edge of the table. "I'm not handing it over." His expression tightened. "Just slightly. You're being emotional. I'm being clear." He leaned back and exhaled through his nose. "We'll talk again. Caleb called that night. Dad says you're making this harder than it needs to be." I said no. A short laugh came through the line. "You're acting like this is personal." "It is." Silence stretched. Then his voice changed. Sharper. Less practiced. "Everyone knows you were just holding that place until I was ready," he said. "Don't delude yourself into thinking it succeeded because of you." Something settled in my chest. Cold. Steady. "I'm not signing anything." "You will," he said, "before this gets ugly." I didn't argue. I didn't warn him. I unlocked my phone, set it face down on the table, and started recording. He kept talking about fairness, about family, about how I wouldn't hold up once things got complicated, how pressure would break me. I let him finish. When the call ended, I stayed seated for a long time, the phone still warm in my hand. Then I saved the file, labeled it with the date, and backed it up twice. After that, I drove back to the studio and taught my evening class like nothing had happened. The envelope arrived on a Friday, thick and formal, my name centered and clean like it belonged there. I carried it inside, set it on the counter, and washed my hands before opening it. That pause felt necessary. The filing was careful. Too careful. petition for transfer of ownership, allegations of diminished capacity, a claim of undue influence over my grandfather during the final months of his life. The language stayed calm while pointing a finger. Caleb was listed as petitioner. Mom and Dad had signed declarations. I read every page. Then I read them again. The words didn't accuse me of being careless. They accused me of being incapable, while insisting I had the clarity to sign everything away. I didn't call anyone in my family. I called Jonah Reed. He answered quickly and told me to come by. His office smelled like coffee and paper. He took the packet, flipped through it without comment, then set it down. "They're trying to scare you," he said. "This is pressure, not proof. They're saying I manipulated my grandfather." He nodded once. "That's the angle. Undue influence. Diminished capacity. If they can make the will look suspect, they don't need to explain the rest." And the transfer a small pause. That's where it breaks. You can't argue someone lacks capacity and then demand a valid signature from the same person. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Over the next few days, I brought him everything. Receipts from before the studio turned a profit. Repair invoices, equipment purchases, certification records, emails with dates and timestamps. The audio file from my phone. Jonah listened to the recording once, straight through. He didn't interrupt. When it ended, he closed the folder and looked at me. "This changes the posture of the case." At the studio, I kept things normal. Classes ran on time. The van went out for sunrise sessions. People moved quietly, rolled mats, stayed to talk. I didn't mention court. One evening, a woman lingered by the door. "You seem focused," she said. "Grounded. I've had practice." I told her, that night. I locked up and sat on the floor, back against the wall. My phone buzzed with messages I didn't open. I organized files instead, labeled, backed up, duplicated. The lawsuit wasn't meant to win in court. It was meant to make me react. I stayed still and let the record speak. The courtroom felt different the second time. Not louder, not quieter. Just tighter, like there was less room for pretending. I sat where I had before, hands folded, back straight. Jonah placed his binder on the table and didn't open it right away. Across the aisle, Caleb sat between Mom and Dad again. Dad's suit was darker. Mom's scarf was pinned higher at the collar. Caleb leaned back, confidence still there, but thinner now. Their attorney stood and began with the same calm tone. He spoke about concern, about family stepping in when someone's capacity was diminished. He used the words carefully. Diminished capacity. Undue influence. He suggested my grandfather had been vulnerable, that I had taken advantage of that vulnerability. Caleb testified first. He talked about stress, about how I worked too much, about how I doubted myself. He said he had offered help and been pushed away. Mom followed. Her voice stayed soft. We were worried she couldn't handle it. We reminded her to rest, to slow down. Dad took the stand last. He straightened his tie before speaking. The studio didn't succeed because of Leah's leadership. He said, "It succeeded because the Asheville market surged, because of my father's name. Without someone with real vision, it won't survive." Judge Ortiz listened without interrupting. She asked questions about timing, about money, about when these concerns first appeared. Then she turned to Jonah. "You may proceed." Jonah stood and adjusted his glasses. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs argue that Ms. Merrick lacked the mental capacity to manage her business and to benefit from her grandfather's will." He paused. "They also demanded that she execute a transfer of ownership." Judge Ortiz leaned forward slightly. "If Ms. Merrick lacked capacity," she said, "how was she competent enough to sign a legally binding transfer?" No one answered. Jonah moved on. He laid out receipts dated months before the studio turned a profit. Repairs, equipment, modifications to the van, all paid by me. He showed the timeline of messages, noting how Caleb's interest appeared only after revenue stabilized. Then he addressed the claim of undue influence. The will was properly witnessed and notarized. Jonah said, "There is no evidence of manipulation. There is evidence of effort." He looked at me once. I nodded. The recording played. Caleb's voice filled the room, sharper than it sounded in my memory. "Everyone knows you were just a placeholder until I was ready. Don't delude yourself into thinking it succeeded because of you." The silence afterward was complete. Mom stared at her hands. Dad's jaw tightened. Caleb didn't look up. Judge Ortiz let the moment sit before speaking. "This court finds no credible evidence of diminished capacity or undue influence. There is clear evidence of coercion." She looked directly at Caleb. This was not protection. It was opportunism. The ruling came clean and final. The petition denied. A warning issued against further attempts to interfere. Jonah closed his binder. I stood. "I was never incapable," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I was just never chosen." Judge Ortiz gave a small nod. I sat back down. I didn't go home after court. I drove to the studio. The lock caught for a second, then opened. Inside, the room was still. No music, no voices, just the heater humming and the faint smell of cleaner on the mats. I set my bag down and sat against the wall, letting the quiet settle where the noise used to live. A few days later, Jonah called to confirm the last filings were complete. The studio was placed into an irrevocable trust. I was named trustee and sole beneficiary. Clean lines, no gaps. The trust owned the studio now, not me as an individual. There was nothing left to argue with. Mom left a voicemail. Dad sent a short message. Caleb didn't try again. I listened to none of it. I deleted the messages and kept moving. At the studio, things stayed steady. People arrived early. They rolled their mats slowly. Some stayed after class, talking in low voices about work or sleep or nothing at all. One woman smiled as she headed out and said, "I'm glad this place is still here." "So am I," I told her. That evening, I turned off the lights one by one. I stood in the doorway before locking up, keys warm in my hand. For most of my life, silence meant managing other people's comfort. It meant shrinking, smoothing, waiting. Now it meant something else. Leah Merrick didn't need permission anymore. I didn't need to be understood or approved. I had built something that held me without asking me to disappear inside it. I locked the door and walked to my car. The night air felt clear, not triumphant, just open. We stayed with Leah's story because some endings don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, and when they do, the only thing left to do is keep walking forward.